Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today we're taking a deep dive into Jonathan Coe's really expansive novel, Middle England. And this isn't just a story about a few characters, it's more like a detailed chronicle of a society in profound
It
flux.
really is. It documents that period between 2010 and 2018 in Britain. It's a novel that maps the very landscape of a fracture.
I think that's the perfect way to put it.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. The core question this book helps us explore is, I think, absolutely fundamental to understanding modern Western politics.
Mm.
How does a society manage these huge system-wide shifts in economics, in culture, national identity, and what happens when those changes accelerate far beyond the capacity of its political system to actually respond?
And it matters so intensely right now because, well, while Coe is focusing on the UK, the fracture points he's mapping are pretty much universal.
They really are.
We're talking about the deep schisms of modern life, the urban versus the provincial, native versus newcomer, and that persistent sort of gnawing anxiety that's caused by financial volatility.
Which all leads, of course, to the Brexit vote. It serves as this massive pressure release valve for all of these accumulated tensions.
Exactly.
And our mission here, for you listening, is to focus relentlessly on the mechanics of how this pressure built up and then released. We are analyzing the system.
Right. We want to look at how that deep economic anxiety, which really took root after the 2008 crash, combines with these powerful cultural narratives.
Things like nostalgia, a sense of lost identity, perceived injustice.
And how all that together produces these profound mass political outcomes. We're really focused on why the system created this outcome, not who to blame.
Exactly. We're letting the narrative guide our understanding of the institutional failures at play here. So let's start by establishing the context of the novel and its author. The book is Middle England by Jonathan Coe. He's a critically distinguished novelist known for his exceptionally sharp political and social satire.
Yeah, but this book is, I think, more than just satire. It almost reads like a historical document, just one that's told through fiction.
That's a great point. And Coe is particularly noted for his skill in using the same long-running cast of characters to map decades of British history.
Which gives his work this immense narrative gravity, doesn't it?
It really does. Middle England is actually the third book in a series. It follows the Rotters Club and the Close Circle.
And these books track characters like Benjamin Trotter. He's the thoughtful, sort of melancholic writer, and his sister Lois, right from their school days in the 1970s up to the present day.
And that long arc allows him to show how, childhood experiences can become the foundations for adult political decisions 40 years down the line.
And what's fascinating, and I think it speaks to the urgency of the moment he was writing in, is that Coe didn't initially intend to write a third novel in this series at all.
Right. He mentions two specific influences that made him realize he had to write this story.
The first was seeing a dramatization of the Rotters Club, and that experience highlighted for him the central, really complex love and rivalry between Benjamin and Lois. He realized these characters still had stories and, arguments left to tell.
But the real catalyst was a discussion with his editor at Penguin, wasn't it?
Mm.
They were talking about writing a novel based explicitly on the Brexit referendum.
Yes, and he recognized immediately that this existing cast of middle-class characters who already embody decades of varied British experience.
From the decaying industrial Midlands to the, cosmopolitan heart of London.
You were the perfect vehicle. They naturally span the geography, the class structures, the intellectual divides, everything you need to cover this national conflict comprehensively and with genuine human depth.
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have characters whose history you've known for 40 years, their choices in 2016 carry real, actual weight.
The historical moment the novel covers is just pivotal, and Coe sets the time frame with such precision. It spans from April 2010.
Starting with the funeral of Benjamin's mother, Sheila.
Right, and importantly, this coincides with the election campaign, where Gordon Brown, who is the prime minister then, was famously caught on a hot mic.
The bigoted woman moment. He was talking to a supporter, Gillian Duffy, and called her a sort of bigoted woman.
And that opening juxtaposition is a systems diagnosis in itself.
Oh, absolutely. The personal grief of a family's loss set right against the political implosion of a sitting prime minister, caught expressing this condescension toward the very people he claimed to represent.
It establishes the theme that just runs and runs throughout the book, this immense, almost unbridgeable gulf between the political class and the provincial middle class they govern.
A relationship defined by mutual distrust and these, intellectual superiority complexes on both sides.
And the novel then tracks this trajectory all the way up to 2018, deep in the turmoil of the post-Brexit world. It gives us this granular, almost painful view of the socio-political climate leading directly to that 2016 EU referendum.
So if we were to distill the book down to its central thesis, what's the core takeaway Coe wants us to grasp?
I think it's this. The novel uses the personal narratives of these middle-class families, particularly the ones rooted in the Midlands, to map the profound geographic and psychological divisions in England.
And its core argument.
Its core argument is that the system-driven changes, the macro shifts in finance, government policy, austerity, all of that resulted in a collective state of what he calls radical indecision.
Right. And that indecision, rather than leading to careful compromise, was channeled into a final, highly volatile expression of anger.
An anger fueled by these powerful cultural narratives of lost privilege, of betrayal, and a really deep-seated nostalgia for a past that, well, likely never even existed in the first place.
So the system, in short, manufactured the emotional conditions for the vote.
That's it, exactly.
That thesis sets us up perfectly for the core insights Coe extracts from this turbulent period. We often talk about how systemic failures are rarely singular events. They accumulate.
And the first one, arguably the most crucial systemic failure that sets the stage for everything else, is that lingering, corrosive anger over the 2008 financial crash.
And, crucially, the complete lack of accountability that followed.
This is where the emotional energy for the later populist political movements truly originates. Coe doesn't just mention the crash, he shows its immediate impact on the public mood.
Through Doug, right, the journalist character.
Yes, Doug observes this anger firsthand on the 2010 campaign trail for Gordon Brown. He notes that the public is furious not just because they suffered, but because the city traders who practically crashed the economy
Face no consequences.
no consequences, and they were taking their bonuses again.
That specific detail, the bonuses, is so vital. It's not just about losing money. It's about a profound moral injury. It's the visual evidence that the rules apply differently depending on where you are in the economic hierarchy.
Precisely. And meanwhile, the rest of the country was being told that national necessity demanded austerity.
Which resulted in frozen pensions, wage stagnation that lasted for a decade, persistent job insecurity.
And Doug encapsulates that psychological shift perfectly. He says, a few years ago they felt wealthy, now they feel poor.
Their material reality was suddenly diminished, and they were told it was their collective fault, while the perpetrators were actively being rewarded.
And this isn't just an economic point, it's a deeply political one. This sense of economic diminishment is critical because it fundamentally erodes public trust.
Not just in the financial system, but in all political actors who appeared helpless or worse, complicit.
Yes. When Doug tries to discuss genuine corruption, like the 2009 parliamentary expenses scandal, the cynical public response is already baked in. It's just, oh, they're all as bad as each other.
And that widespread, deep-seated cynicism creates a political vacuum. When trust is at zero, the electorate becomes incredibly susceptible to non-rational appeals.
Anger, rather than rational policy, becomes the default emotional driver of political behavior.
The systemic failures of financial regulation and political enforcement essentially guarantee that the public loses faith in the very mechanisms that are meant to protect them.
And that anger is just sitting there waiting for a target.
And that anger finds its targets by connecting directly to our second key insight, this geographical and cultural schism. What Coe presents as the Great Divide between cosmopolitan London and provincial Middle England.
Or even deeper, what he calls Deep England.
We see this played out so beautifully through the characters' residences and their life choices. Sophie, Benjamin's niece, she's the quintessential Londoner.
Oh, absolutely. She thrives in the city's complex environment. She loves its overcrowded, improvised, somewhat self-satisfied cosmopolitanism.
She delights in the babble of voices, the French, Italian, Urdu, Bengali. For her, that diversity is vitality. The system of the city is constantly evolving and vibrant.
But then she relocates to Birmingham, right, seeking a change of pace. And she finds the Midlands comparably monocultural, slower, and defined by a kind of introspection that feels alien compared to the constant outward-looking movement of London.
You contrast that with Benjamin, the writer. He actively retreats to a secluded mill house in Shropshire.
He's seeking escape in the ageless, immutable murmur of the River Severn. His choice is a conscious rejection of the noise, the pace, the complexity of modern metropolitan life.
He's looking for the quiet of a stable, unchanging system. The river flowing past year after year, as an antidote to all the political chaos.
And even his father, Colin, who's a retired Midlands industrial worker, finds Benjamin's retreat too remote. He calls it the middle of nowhere.
Which shows how that Middle England identity is itself fragmented. It's located
Sure.
somewhere between the metropolis and total pastoral isolation.
And Coe explores the deeper psychological geography of this divide through Sohan, the character who researches Deep England.
Right, Sohan asks, is this Deep England a physical pastoral ideal? The realm of Tolkien's Shire or Constable's idealized paintings?
Or is it something more nebulous? A psychological state that's tied to older, more melancholic cultural figures like the composers Elgar and Vaughan Williams.
And that national yearning is crucial. It suggests that the desire for Deep England isn't really about physical geography at all. It's about a yearning for a lost, definable, simple identity.
An identity that the complex, diverse, and financially volatile reality of modern life, especially London, simply doesn't satisfy. The complexity of the modern system drives people to seek simplicity in an idealized path.
And that's what makes the search for identity inherently political. When people feel economically diminished, that's insight 1, and geographically displaced insight 2, they start looking for an external explanation.
Which moves us perfectly to the third core insight: the rise of the victimhood narrative and the profound sense of erosion of traditional and often unacknowledged privilege.
This is one of the most powerful and, frankly, uncomfortable analytical points the book makes.
It really is. The core argument here is that for some members of the established majority, the people who historically benefited from the established system, well, institutional moves toward equality and diversity aren't seen as societal progress.
No, they're seen as an oppressive force. They feel they are being actively attacked by the tyranny of political correctness.
The examples Coe provides are so immediate and relatable. You take Ian's mother, Helena. She is furious because her son, a seemingly qualified white male middle-class candidate, fails to get a promotion.
And she instantly attributes his failure to the successful candidate's ethnic background and her skin color.
She doesn't consider any alternative reasons. For her, the system must be rigged against Ian. Her conclusion is dramatic. White, male, straight, middle-class people are now the unprotected group.
And that is the language of displacement, isn't it? The belief that their formerly guaranteed slot in the hierarchy is being actively dismantled by hostile forces.
This sense of injustice is then amplified by figures like Colin, Ian's father-in-law, who regularly grumbles about the bloody political correctness brigade whenever immigrants like those from the Windrush generation or diversity in general are mentioned.
And Ian himself becomes morbidly obsessed with this concept of being PC.
Coe expertly shows the mechanism at play here. When systems change to become more equitable, when the benefits that were previously allocated by default, by privilege, are distributed more widely, those who benefited from the previous status quo interpret the change as a moral injury.
And a loss of deserved privilege.
That's the key. That is precisely why the quote Coe uses in the book, attributed to Iyad el-Baghdadi, lands with such weight.
To the privileged, equality feels like a step down. Understand this, and you understand a lot of populist politics today.
It's that sense of downward mobility, both material and cultural, that generates this powerful, localized anger. An anger that is then ready to be leveraged by political forces. It's a systemic critique disguised as a character flaw.
And that intense sense of cultural loss and anger is so often expressed through nostalgia. Which brings us to our fourth insight. Coe labels this profound focus on the past as nostalgia as the English disease.
It's presented as a debilitating national condition, really. It's built on the belief that a crucial defining moment, the unraveling of the entire post-war system, occurred in 1979 when Margaret Thatcher came to power.
And the present is just seen as an endless decline from that single point.
Benjamin embodies this perfectly. His life in the Mill House is literally built on a perverse effort to recapture the past.
He's focusing on the quiet, simple, immutable flow of the River Severn. He wants to stop time, escaping the noise of progress and political instability.
He even admits he may have peaked at the age of 18, which suggests that the most meaningful part of the system he belonged to is long, long gone.
But the most poignant, almost heartbreaking example of this failure to deal with present economic reality is Colin's visit to the site of the old Longbridge car plant in the Midlands.
Oh, that scene is devastating. Colin was part of that industrial system, and he just can't process its end.
He searches for the physical anchors of his past, the conveyor bridge, the Westworks, CAB 1 and 2.
And they are all gone, completely demolished. In their place is a shiny new retail park with a Marks and Spencer food hall, a block of new houses, and perhaps most symbolically, a Prosecco bar.
And his absolute inability to reconcile this shift is a profound systems failure, recognized by an ordinary man. He asks this question: how can you replace a factory with shops? If there's no factory, how are people supposed to make the money to spend in the shops?
That question just encapsulates the failure of industrial Britain to navigate the transition to a modern service and consumer-based economy.
For Colin, the new reality, the fancy clothes and Prosecco bars and bloody packets of salad, it's not progress. It's an incomprehensible softening of the country's economic and moral backbone.
He feels betrayed not by individuals but by the collapse of the entire industrial system that defined his life and his sense of self-worth.
This inability to look forward leads us right to the final crucial insight for this section: the nature of the new political system itself.
One driven entirely by spin, by banter, and by what Coe terms radical indecision.
Doug, the journalist, gives us that insider insight into the culture of modern governance through his contact Nigel Ives, who works in the Downing Street press office during the coalition government.
And Nigel is a master of rhetorical deflection. He frames these complex structural issues in light, almost superficial terms.
When he's analyzing the inconclusive 2010 election, Nigel argues that the people didn't speak with a divided voice. He says they spoke with a loud, unanimous, decisive voice saying, "We don't know."
He calls this radical indecision the new spirit of our times.
That is just a devastating political diagnosis, isn't it?
It is. It suggests that the political class is governing not based on a mandate or ideology or any conviction, but by simply managing a collective state of high anxiety and profound indecision.
They're managing the system's symptoms, not solving its underlying structural failures.
And the method of management is often just reductionist. Nigel frames cabinet discussions as being driven by top banter. He uses this idea of surface-level jocularity and rhetorical gamesmanship to mask profound, life-altering issues.
We see this political mechanism for deflecting structural blame so clearly when Doug tries to discuss the 2011 riots as a political event.
Right, one rooted in issues of race, poverty, power.
And Nigel immediately and officially reframes them as purely criminal, not political.
And that's the system at work, ensuring that structural problems that require deep systemic reform are converted into simple, rhetorical conflicts, crime, cultural grievances that can be managed by sound bites rather than solved by policy.
It validates Doug's cynical view. The governance system prioritizes narrative control over systemic health.
Right. Yes. Okay, so now we shift our focus to crisis and perception specialty, systems mapping. How do all these individual anxieties, the economic failure, the cultural displacement, the nostalgia, how do they coalesce into a functioning political machine that's capable of producing a result like Brexit? Coe essentially details what we can call the anger exploitation system.
The Brexit referendum, in this view, was the pressure release valve the system provided. It allowed this deep, accumulated anger to vent.
But critically, without requiring the fundamental structures of power to actually change. To understand how this works, we have to look really closely at the actors involved.
First up, we have the Oxbridge political elite. Doug, through his cynicism, paints them so vividly. The leadership at the time, Cameron, Johnson, Gove, they're all drawn from a single, highly privileged generation and social circle.
Oxford in the 80s, debating at the Oxford Union, the notorious Bullingdon Club.
And this is important because it illustrates a closed system of power. Doug argues bitterly that these men are still running the country through the very sad little arguments and infighting that they honed 30 years ago.
Using national policy as a battleground for settling old university scores.
And the consequence of this highly localized, privileged infighting is that it profoundly shapes the lives of everyone else in the country, whether they voted for them or not.
The national destiny is effectively being decided by the narrow, self-referential culture of a tiny elite.
But they're not the only actors. Then you have the true power brokers, the shadowy lobbies, specifically organizations like the Imperium Foundation.
This is a far-right, wealthy think tank linked to the industrialist Ronald Culpeper. Doug investigates them pretty thoroughly.
And what's crucial here is understanding their incentive. Doug notes they are not a charity. They're a group pushing free trade and helping big American corporations get an entry into British markets.
Especially healthcare and the welfare system. Their goals are purely economic, deregulation, and the privatization of public services.
This is where the systems analysis gets really sharp. The foundation itself doesn't need to be popular, it just needs chaos. Their strategy is revealed in their own internal paper, Keeping the Fires Burning.
And this paper outlines the role of the media strategists. It's a blueprint for political manipulation. Their aim is explicit: to build alliances with print and broadcast media to sustain and harness the energies behind the referendum result.
So they don't care about sovereignty or immigration. They see the referendum outcome as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to further their free trading, deregulation aims for financial profit.
They're trying to turn an emotional popular vote into a permanent structural shift.
And finally, we have the discontented electorate, the 51.9% of Leave voters.
The Imperium paper recognizes this cohort as a coalition of different groups, seeking everything from sovereignty to lower immigration. And crucially, the actual allies of Imperium, the ones seeking massive economic deregulation, are acknowledged as only a small minority within that coalition.
Which means the system relies on hiding the true beneficiaries of the outcome.
So you have these actors, but their incentives are completely misaligned. Cameron's motive for calling the referendum wasn't national unity or necessity. It was primarily to silence a few annoying people in his own party.
Pure political survival and self-preservation, trumping the national interest.
Then, the Imperium Foundation's primary incentive is pure deregulation and profit. They want to use the energy of public anger to dismantle EU regulations and create favorable trading conditions with the US and Asia, directly profiting the financial elite.
And the discontented electorate, meanwhile, is incentivized by the promise of cultural validation, of reclaiming a specific, nostalgic vision of Britishness territory they feel they've lost to political correctness.
So the system functions by aligning these three disparate goals for one brief, critical moment. Cameron gets temporary quiet, the electorate gets a cultural vote, and Imperium gets structural change.
The convergence is temporary, but the structural change is permanent.
And this architecture leads to two critical feedback loops that reinforce these outcomes, ensuring the system persists even when the majority suffers. The first is the anger redirection loop.
Okay, let's trace this carefully. Economic inequality and austerity, the pain Doug observed biting hard post-2008, that generates widespread public anger against the established order. That's the starting point.
Right. And then political actors, like those associated with Imperium, realize they can't address the economic root cause, which would require regulating the city and increasing corporate accountability. So they amplify the anger, but strategically redirect the blame.
They shift the focus entirely, away from the city, the financial elite, domestic austerity policies, and instead focus the rage onto cultural issues, immigration, and the European Union.
They provide an external, often dehumanized target for that anger.
And the result is emotional voting, which Doug predicts is won entirely on slogans and sound bites and instincts and emotions.
This emotional vote secures a result, Brexit, that ultimately benefits the economic interests of the financial elite through deregulation, even if it harms the very working and middle-class voters who delivered the result.
The energy of the discontented is successfully harnessed and channeled away from the true sources of structural inequality.
It's a classic misdirection.
Wait, but isn't it too cynical to suggest all Leave voters were just manipulated? Where does the book show us a genuine, non-economic reason for the vote, maybe tied to sovereignty, that wasn't purely exploitation?
That's an essential nuance, and I think Coe respects it by showing the diversity of the Leave coalition. For characters like Colin, it's genuinely about sovereignty and the return to an idealized, powerful Britain.
So he sees it as a moral act of reclamation.
He does. However, the system analysis shows that while his intent is moral, the outcome is structurally controlled by the Imperium Foundation. His genuine desire for sovereignty is the fuel. Imperium provides the engine and steers the direction.
So the system uses moral desires to achieve amoral economic ends.
Exactly. The system doesn't negate the sincerity of the voters. It simply ensures the ultimate material benefit accrues elsewhere.
That makes sense. Let's look at the second loop then, the expertise rejection loop.
This one is just a devastating structural failure of governance. The governing class, driven by the need to manage anxiety and win rhetorical battles, makes promises based entirely on spin and strategy, what Nigel called banter.
And when real expert advice from economists, civil servants, legal scholars is offered, it's just increasingly ignored.
Nigel states it plainly. We don't believe in experts anymore, remember? And this isn't just a political soundbite. It's a systemic decision to prioritize narrative control over evidenced policy.
This willful rejection of expertise leads directly to policy instability. We see it in Cameron offering a risky 50-50 vote, based on internal party management.
And later, Theresa May setting these arbitrary, rigid deadlines, like 29 March 2019, against all sound diplomatic advice.
And the paradoxical outcome of this instability is that it heightens public anxiety, the very thing the system is supposed to be trying to manage.
And that anxiety, in turn, fuels the public's need for simple, comforting assurances like strong and stable slogans.
Which further justifies the political class's preference for rhetorical assurance over nuanced, difficult policy debate.
So, essentially, the system ensures that by voting emotionally and rejecting expertise, the public ends up supporting the very systems and actors responsible for the problems they were trying to solve in the first place.
Moving into present-day implications, we see the consequences of this system operating on a really individual level, notably in governance and the modern workplace. The system, once built for stability, now seems to reward reactive emotional governance.
Let's start there. After the referendum, the power dynamic shifts dramatically. Theresa May, the new prime minister, takes over. Nigel, the Downing Street operative, describes her as taking her instructions not from traditional policy advisors or the civil service,
but directly from external, often ideological forces, like the Daily Mail and those far-right think tanks.
This confirms Doug's earlier cynical prediction that people vote with their gut, and that therefore governance must be won and maintained on emotion.
It's governance by algorithm, isn't it? Where policy responds immediately to the most sensational or emotionally charged headline of the day, rather than rational long-term development.
The political system is now perpetually reactive to the loudest cultural anxieties.
And this instability manifests in the new peril facing the modern workplace, particularly within institutional structures like Sophie's University.
Yes, Coe shows us how the system of equality and diversity, while noble in its intent to be protective and equitable, creates this immense institutional complexity that can quickly generate high-stakes, paralyzing conflicts.
This is a brilliant, unsettling anecdote. Sophie's an art historian. She faces being reported for breach of equal opportunities legislation
Over a seemingly minor comment described as a huge microaggression about a student's indecision.
And the context is so crucial. She wasn't talking about gender identity or race. She was referring back to a trivial academic debate they had about which painting came first in a sequence.
Joking about the student's historical indecisiveness. Yet the language of institutional protection immediately transforms this academic slip into a potential career-ending moral crisis.
Her department head, Martin, who specializes in something utterly removed from modern social conflict flax in the early 17th century, and who finds emotion absolutely terrifying.
He focuses solely on the proper procedures. He's incapable of applying human judgment because the system incentivizes avoiding risk at all costs.
This scene highlights how social media and the language of litigation can amplify localized disputes into massive institutional crises. In this new system, even simple tact becomes redefined as a legal necessity under the specter of serious litigation and reputation damage.
The system is so complex and sensitive to moral language that it can punish an intentless comment as gravely as deliberate hostility. It just breeds fear and internal moral retreat.
And this high-stakes, unforgiving environment contrasts so sharply with our final point in this section, the immense unpredictable role of contingency in life choices.
The novel reminds us that not all systemic forces are grand political machinations. Sometimes they are utterly, utterly mundane.
The conversation with Nahid, the speed awareness instructor, illustrates how these seemingly minor regulatory systems can radically and irrevocably reroute an individual's destiny.
Sophie was caught by a standard speed camera doing 37 in a 30 zone on her way to Solihull Station. A trivial event, a regulatory fine.
But this forced her to attend the obligatory speed awareness course.
And it's there that she met Ian, her future husband, and Nahid, the insightful instructor.
Nahid, witnessing hundreds of lives briefly intersecting over a bureaucratic requirement, reflects on this pattern. He says, every choice you make has the potential to alter your life, sometimes radically.
A speed camera ticket led directly to Sophie's marriage and her move from cosmopolitan London to provincial Hartlepool.
It reveals that the mundane often overlooks systems we interact with every day. Traffic laws, bureaucracy, mandatory courses are the true hidden interceptors of destiny.
They're capable of pushing us toward unforeseen, high-stakes life outcomes that feel like fate, but are merely the consequence of interlocking regulatory structures. These specific narratives connect back so deeply to the broader themes we often examine here on crisis and perception. systems, power, and outcomes. Coe pushes us to see the crisis not as a political argument, but as a long-term structural collapse.
And the first connection Coe draws is the establishment of a definite 1979 watershed.
The book argues compellingly that the root of the current crisis, including the ultimate volatility of Brexit, is not recent. It wasn't created by Cameron or even the 2008 crash.
It stems from the gradual, decades-long unraveling of the post-war consensus that began around 1979, the year Margaret Thatcher came to power.
Charlie, Benjamin's old friend, who often provides the clear historical voice, he sums this up. Welfare state, NHS, everything that was put in place after the war, well, all that's been unraveling since '79.
And the implication of that is profound. Brexit is merely a symptom, a final volatile gasp of despair of this decades-long disintegration of the stable system built after World War II.
A system designed around collective responsibility and industrial stability. The system was already hollowed out by economic and political decisions made over 30 years. The referendum just exposed the rot.
This systemic decay relates so intensely to the novel's focus on individual psychological retreat, what we can call systemic cowardice and moral retreat.
Benjamin, the writer, tends toward moral cowardice. He deliberately retreats into his internal, imaginative, universe-making pasta, listening to music, private contemplation, to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths.
He avoids confronting his friend Doug's terrible parenting, and he certainly avoids the toxicity of national political debates. He tries to design his own stable, small-scale system of life.
And this personal retreat is mirrored by a broader national trend, Coe suggests, toward becoming inner immigrants. A conscious withdrawal from collective life and confrontation with difficult system realities.
Benjamin admits he came to Shropshire to get away from the crowds, the noise, the pace of life, the stress, the expense of multicultural London.
The insight here is crucial for systems analysis. When large-scale systems become too complex, too toxic, or too frustrating to engage with, the individual coping mechanism is retreat.
But the collective consequence of this withdrawal is a failure to participate in the necessary, painful process of fixing those systems. The retreat guarantees the persistence of the problem.
And finally, Coe addresses the immediate critical danger inherent in the anger exploitation system, highlighting the price of sustained anger.
Doug issues a terrifying warning to Ron Culpeper of the Imperium Foundation. He underscores the extreme risk of utilizing systemic rage as a primary tool of political mobilization.
Doug essentially says to Culpeper, "You are playing with fire. You're stoking public anger for purely economic and political gain. You think you can control this force, but you can't."
He confronts him, noting that while some show their anger merely by grumbling and voting for Brexit, the sustained nature of the political rage being engineered by Imperium can lead to far more destructive actions by a highly alienated few.
And Doug lays out the dark implication clearly, predicting exactly what happens tragically in the real world. Some of them go out into the street one morning with a flak jacket full of knives and stab their local MP to death.
It underscores the ultimate moral price the system pays when powerful hidden actors actively sustain and harness rage to achieve their economic ends, crossing the boundary between political rhetoric and real-world physical violence.
So after tracking the economic anxiety, the cultural narratives, the political spin, and all the systemic consequences, what does Middle England ultimately help us see differently about our current crisis?
I think it forces us to look past simple political labels, leave or remain, left or right, and to recognize that the defining characteristic of modern conflict is this brutal collision between material reality and competing, deeply nostalgic cultural narratives.
And that material reality is that economic systems, particularly the post-2008 regulatory environment and prolonged austerity, are failing the middle class, and that leads to legitimate mass anger.
But that anger is then expertly exploited by powerful, often hidden actors like the Imperium Foundation, who channel it directly toward culture wars and external targets like the EU.
And this redirection prevents the public from demanding structural change to the economy itself.
Why this perspective matters so much is that the novel reminds us that the state of a country is the sum of its internal, often contradictory systems: economic, political, cultural, moral. You just can't separate the national mood from the systems that produce it.
And in a final, really melancholic reflection, Benjamin, having moved away and found his quiet space in France, realizes that his old home, England, the one he loved and sought to recapture,
Had only ever existed in his imagination. A nostalgic fantasy built on the music of Vaughan Williams and the poetry of the past.
This suggests that the current crisis is fundamentally one of misplaced expectations. an inability on a national scale to deal with the present as it actually is, rather than as it was or as we wished it could be.
The system failed to deliver the promised future, and so the population retreated to an idealized past.
And the book leaves us with a final provocative question. It's rooted in Benjamin's own coping mechanism, one that speaks directly to the consequences of systemic overload.
He wonders if a less intense, deeper happiness can be found in withdrawing entirely from the chaos, focusing on the small scale, on making pasta, on listening to music, on private contemplation.
Is the ultimate, perhaps unconscious, coping mechanism for overwhelming systemic crisis the conscious choice of quiet underachievement and private retreat?
And if so, what are the collective political consequences of an entire population making such an escape? That brings our deep dive to a close. Our thanks to Jonathan Coe for Middle England.
If these ideas resonated with you, we highly encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author if you found the ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.